We're standing where the Tchefuncte River exhales into Lake Pontchartrain. Dark water, brackish air, the kind of place that seeps into your clothes and stays with you. This is where life on the North Shore first dug in its hills. Long before asphalt and subdivisions, the Tchefuncte people were here, pulling fish slick with mud out of the river, prying open oysters, firing thick clay bowls, the first pottery in Louisiana. They left behind mountains of shells and bones, now called middens, not because they cared about history, but because that's what survival back then looked like. By the 1700s, Choctaw villages lined these banks, before the French wandered in, half lost and wholly unprepared. The French built no grand chateaus here, planted no neat rows of crops. They just built rough timber camps hacked out of the swamp, sweat, mud, pine pitch, and cheap rum. The area became a weird cocktail of Choctaw grit and French Catholic ritual, and from that messy mix, St. Tammany Parish began to take shape. The truth is, this place never belonged to tidy streets or polite society. It belonged, and still belongs, to the water, the rivers, the bayous, the lakes. Every wave out here carries a ghost, a memory, a reminder that life has always been dictated by the pull of the tides. The Tchefuncte River Lighthouse is a survivor. Built in the 1830s as a squat brick cone with 10 lamps and a keeper who kept pet alligators, it guided ships across Lake Pontchartrain with its bold black stripes. The Civil War left it battered, but in 1868, it rose again, taller and tougher, with a lantern stolen from Cat Island. Technology kept shifting, but the brick bones never quit. By 1939, automation sent the keepers packing. Their cottage was dragged inland while the tower kept flashing. Nearly 2 centuries later, scarred, patched, and fighting erosion, it's a stubborn lighthouse that refuses to die. Madisonville didn't start out polished. First it was coke, a rough nickname for the ancient pile of oyster shells left behind by people who lived here long before flags and borders. Under the Spanish, it became Port de Tchefuncte, a name that sounded important, but mostly meant a muddy outpost on a restless river. Then the Americans showed up, chest out, bourbon in hand, and slapped a new name on it, Madisonville. Finally a real town, shipyards hammering, lumber floating out by the ton, taverns spilling into the dirty streets. It wasn't neat, it wasn't pretty, but it was the first real town in St. Tammany Parish. The Dindinger House sits on Covington Street, like an old aristocrat who's seen it all. Built in 1911, it straddles two worlds, colonial revival order on one side, eccentric Queen Anne style on the other. Hexagonal bays jut out like elbows, fish scale shingles ripple across the gables, and the porch leans on Tuscan columns that once signaled prosperity in a sleepy river town. There's even an outbuilding still standing, the kind of place where laundry was boiled, cars were tucked away, and servants lived their lives in the shadow of someone else's wealth. That house hasn't left the Dindinger family's hands, and in 1992 it finally got the nod from the National Register of Historic Places, an acknowledgement that Madisonville's story isn't just boats and sawmills, but also the stubborn survival of homes like this one, built to impress, and somehow still doing the job. On the corner of Cedar and St. John, where a highway sliced through sleepy little Madisonville, sits the old Madisonville Bank, a brick survivor from a time when this little river town dreamed big. Built plain and functional in the early 1900s, it got a serious facelift in 1919. Corinthian columns slapped on its corners, a wraparound storefront that looked like it belonged in New Orleans instead of a lumber port on the Tchefuncte. It's one of the only two buildings from Madisonville's boom years that made it out alive. By 1983, even the feds admitted it was too good to lose and stuck it on the National Register of Historic Places. Today, it's less about deposits and ledgers and more about the story it tells. How a rough little town on the river tried to look respectable, dressed its bank up like a cathedral of commerce, and a century later, it still works. You can stand on that corner and feel it, the ghost of ambition baked right into its bricks. The Madisonville Cemetery doesn't whisper history, it shouts it, even through the moss and cracked stone. Located at the north end of Main Street, this patch of ground has been collecting the town's dead since the late 1700s, making it the oldest cemetery on the North Shore. You got Charles Parent Sr., the old commandant, planted here in 1804, his widow, Jeanne, following soon after. Founding families, War of 1812 soldiers, even a son of Governor Claiborne. They're all here, the bones beneath the roots of Madisonville's story. For years it was abandoned, choked with weeds, left to rot like a forgotten promise, until locals and volunteers dragged it back from the brink. Now plaques and markers tell you who's who, but the real story is in the silence. Centuries of settlers, infants, mothers, soldiers, laid down in Louisiana soil. Their names barely hanging on, their presence still heavy in the air. Madisonville's old town hall isn't fancy, but it was never meant to be. Built in 1911 out of brick and stone, it's a solid workmanlike building. The kind of place where civic business got hammered out without much ceremony. The double staircase climbing up the front looks almost theatrical, but instead it was all grit. Council meetings, town records, and the daily grind of small town governance. For decades it was the nerve center until 1976, when politics moved somewhere else and the cops moved in. These days, it shed the paperwork and patrol cars and reinvented itself as the Madisonville Historic Museum. It got its spot on the National Register in 1990, not because it's pretty, but because it's real. Still standing, still telling the story of a place that doesn't forget where it came from. Tucked beneath the museum's main level, the ground floor of the old courthouse retains its original construction. 6 sturdy jail cells, crafted from concrete and evoking a palpable sense of early 20th century law enforcement. These cells, once cold and confining, now wear new identities as immersive exhibit spaces. Visitors descend into this atmospheric underworld and are greeted not with bars of punishment, but with windows into Madisonville's past, transformed into themed displays that merge history with haunting authenticity. Inside that old jailhouse, I picked up a lesson I hadn't bargained for. Not the obvious one. Everybody knows it's better to be on the outside of the bars than the inside of them. No, this was stranger. This was a saga of the Madisonville jailbird. Picture Madisonville in 2022. A little river town where boats ride gentle on the Tchefuncte and folks still wave from their porches like Eisenhower's in office. Then, out of nowhere, headlines. Not a hurricane, not corruption, even though this is Louisiana, not even a fist fight at the gas station. No sir, a rooster. One crow-happy, sun-up shouting scoundrel who ruffled just enough feathers that the law went and wrote him up. An arrest warrant for a chicken. Charge, foul disturbance. Now, they never did drag the bird off in chains, mainly because they couldn't catch it, but the paper trail was real enough, and in Madisonville, that was all it took. The whole business turned into theater, half joke, half gossip, all small-town spectacle. The story spread quicker than spilled whiskey, over beers, over barbecue, in the grocery line. Next thing you know, WWL-TV branded him the jailbird rooster and a legend was hatched. Then came the naming contest, reward posters, outlaw nicknames fit for a dime novel. Folks leaned in hard to the ridiculous, and the bird went from backyard nuisance to folk hero. Ask around today and you'll still hear it. From a bartender, from a grandmother, maybe even a deputy who swears the paperwork's still filed away somewhere. As for the rooster himself, he may be long gone, or he may still be strutting down some alley crowing like he owns the parish. But the tale, well, that lives on. Proof enough that in Madisonville, Louisiana, even a rooster can end up immortal. And sometimes the jailhouse walls hold stories louder than the cells ever did. The Lake Pontchartrain Basin Maritime Museum in Madisonville isn't some sterile hall of glass cases. It's more like a working memory of Louisiana's waterlogged soul. Tucked along the Tchefuncte River on Mobile Drive, it's the kind of place where history feels lived in. Boats creak in the sheds, wood shavings curl off a craftsman's blade, and kids learn to steer underwater robots in the same town where shipwrights once shaped the Gulf South's future. The museum's mission is hands-on preservation. Field trips, publications, boat building workshops, and the careful tending of the battered but still standing 1837 Tchefuncte River Lighthouse. They're open Tuesday through Saturday with a admission price like a neighborhood bar tab. $10 for adults, less for seniors, veterans, and students, and free for kids small enough to climb the exhibits. The museum itself is a relatively young thing, founded in 1987 as a project of locals who didn't want their maritime story drowned out by time. It grew from a community boat building program into a full-fledged institution, curating everything from dugout heroes to offshore oil history, while also throwing Madisonville's biggest party, the Wooden Boat Festival. Each October, thousands pack the riverfront for a floating parade of craftsmanship, proof that wood, water, and sweat still mean something here. That makes sense in Madisonville, a town whose lifeblood has always been boat building. Since the early 1800s, when Scottish and Irish settlers turned the Tchefuncte banks into a maritime workshop, shipyards cranked out schooners, sloops, and workboats that kept New Orleans fed, clothed, and connected. By mid-century, Madisonville was the Gulf Coast go-to shipyard town, where timber met saltwater and entire industries launched from cypress-scented slips. During the Civil War, Confederate gunboats rode out of these yards. Later, fishing fleets and all-service craft defined the skyline. Their work was tough, messy, and loud, but it built a reputation that survives in every hand-planed board and caulked seam on the festival docks today. The Maritime Museum isn't just about nostalgia, it's about continuity. It shows how a little river town became a boat-building powerhouse, how a lighthouse kept ships alive through war and hurricanes, and how a community decided its past was worth the trouble of saving. This isn't just a museum, it's Madisonville's anchor. Fairview Riverside State Park isn't just another manicured slice of Louisiana with picnic tables and a boat launch. It's a story of timber money, hard work, and a river that made it all possible. At the center of it all is the Otis House. Built in the 1880s by sawmill owner William Theodore J., the place was meant to impress. 12-foot ceilings, pulling in the summer air, wrap-around verandas for watching the world with a drink in your hand, and heart of pine floors cut straight from the forest his mills were chewing through. It's the kind of house that doesn't whisper wealth, it shouts it. By the 1930s, the house belonged to Frank Otis, a New Orleans businessman who understood its weight in history. When he died, he handed it over to the state, turning private opulence into public heritage. Today, it's a museum, rooms filled with period furnishings and the lingering sense of an era when lumber drove the region and fortunes rose out of sawdust. The park itself sprawls over 99 acres along the Tchefuncte River, a stretch of cypress-shadowed water, fed families and industry for centuries. Now, it's about camping, fishing, barbecuing under the oaks, kids running wild, while boats idle downriver. It's history and recreation smashed together, the elegance of a Gilded Age home, alongside the grit of people who came here for the river, the breeze, and a reminder that this patch of Louisiana belongs to them now. Covington began rough, Spanish West Florida pine and swamp in 1769. In 1813, John Wharton Collins carved a town from the woods. First called Wharton, renamed Covington in 1816. Steamboats soon made it a trade hub, moving lumber, and cotton to New Orleans. Fires in the late 1800s wiped it out, but timber money and ozone air seekers rebuilt it. Covington's always been about grit, reinvention, and survival. Walk through the doors of H.J. Smith & Sons General Store in Covington, and you're not just shopping, you're time traveling. This place has been anchoring the town since 1876. Back when Covington was still a scrappy little hub carved out of pine forest and river trade. It's part hardware store, part museum, part living fossil of a South that never completely disappeared. You can still buy nails by the pound or a tin wash basin off the shelf, then wander past glass cases crammed with Civil War relics, century-old cash registers, a coffin once used as a display piece, and even a petrified rat that has become a local legend. The building smells of wood, dust, and iron, like history itself refusing to be sanitized. Families ran it for generations, each adding another layer of oddities and stories, until the store became as much a community memory bank as a business. It's not polished, not curated to death, just real. A reminder that the small town general store wasn't just a place to buy things. It was where life happened. And in Covington, it still does. The Southern Hotel isn't just another pretty brick box in a Louisiana courthouse square. It's the kind of place that tells you something about the town before you even step through the door. Built in 1907, when Covington was booming as both a lumber hub and a summer retreat for wealthy New Orleanians escaping heat, mosquitoes, and yellow fever, the two-story structure was the crown jewel of the North Shore. It wasn't just a hotel, it was a gathering place. Politicians schemed over drinks in its dining room. Families in linen suits came up off the train and checked into its airy rooms, and you could almost feel the town pivot around its corner. But like a lot of Southern landmarks, the glory days did not last. By the mid-20th century, the Southern had slipped into decline, at one point housing parish offices and even sitting empty, a shell of its former self. For decades, it loomed over downtown Covington like a ghost of better days. Then, in 2014, after a miraculous restoration that stripped away the grime and patched up the old bones, the Southern was reborn as a boutique hotel. Today, it's back to being what it was meant to be, the anchor of the historic district, a mix of old grandeur and new polish, where the past lingers in the pressed tin ceilings and original tile floors. But the cocktails are cold, the beds are soft, and Covington once again has its front porch. Christ Episcopal Church on North New Hampshire Street isn't just a church, it's Covington's oldest surviving public building, and it feels like it. Built in 1846, when the town was still a sleepy outpost, this place has seen everything: yellow fever panics, the Civil War, Reconstruction, boom years, bust years. Its Greek Revival bones are plain but stubborn. Wooden frame, simple lines. The kind of architecture that doesn't try to impress you with grandeur, just endurance. This was the first permanent Episcopal church on the North Shore, planted here when Covington was barely more than a rough market town. During the Civil War, Union soldiers used it as a stable, and afterwards locals scrubbed out the mud and kept worshiping anyway. It has been repaired, renovated, painted over, patched, and prayed in for nearly 180 years. Today, while downtown Covington hums with boutiques, cafes, and weekend festivals, Christ Church still stands, quiet, unassuming, a reminder that history here isn't always in the museums or the plaques. Sometimes it's in the old wood and brick that people refuse to let die. In a town where the new often pushes out the old, this church endures like a survivor with stories it'll never fully tell. Covington lost most of its pre-1880s architecture to two late 19th century fires. The town rebuilt in the 1880s, and while only a few homes are individually on the National Register, most are recognized together within the 100-acre division of St. John Historic District, which includes about 170 contributing buildings. The Frederick House on Vermont Street doesn't whisper its history. It wears it loud, like the swagger of the man who built it. Emil, Boss Frederick, Covington politician, wheeler dealer, and local power broker put this raised 1.5-story house up around 1890, and he didn't go subtle. It's a Queen Anne showpiece, dressed out with stick and Eastlake flourishes, turned spindles, brackets, and delicate woodwork that once screamed money, influence, and style. The kind of house that told you that Frederick wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was the guy pulling the strings. Time has shifted around it, but the bones of the house still hold court, a reminder of when Covington was growing from Piney Woods backwater into a town that wanted to be seen. The Frederick House landed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982, not just for its ornate detailing, but because it's one of the rare survivors of that era's ambition. A little Victorian bravado standing up proud on Vermont Street. Walk past it today and you can almost hear the politics, the deals, the laughter on the porch, and the sense that in Covington, Boss Frederick's shadow once loomed as large as his house still does. Black Flower Apparel and Records on North Columbia Street feels less like a shop and more like a cultural checkpoint. One of those places you stumble into downtown and immediately think, yeah, this is where the soul of the town is hiding. It's not just a polished chain with fluorescent lights and background music. It's a hybrid stitched together like a favorite denim jacket. Half apparel boutique, half record store, all personality. Racks of shirts and oddball fashions hang a few feet away from crates of vinyl. Stacks of cassettes, CDs, even VHS tapes. Formats most of America abandoned, but Covington still spins, rewinds, and treasures. The vibe is creative and loose, the kind of place where browsing turns into conversation, and conversation turns into friendship. You don't just shop here, you sink into it, flipping through the records you didn't know you needed until the sleeve hits your hand. It's part music museum, part counterculture clubhouse, proof that downtown Covington isn't just antiques and wine bars. Black Flower keeps it weird, keeps it human, and gives locals a reason to remember that culture doesn't only live in New Orleans, it can bloom on Columbia Street too. Abita Springs was born from water, first as a Choctaw camp surrounding healing springs, then as a 19th century retreat where hustlers sold miracle cures to New Orleanians escaping the heat and yellow fever. The railroad turned it into a booming resort town, drawing thousands who believed that the waters could fix whatever was ailing them. Automobiles eventually ended the spa craze, but the old cottages and Victorian homes, they stayed. Abita Springs still carries that mix of legend and charm, a town built on the promise of water that never really lost its magic. The Abita Springs Historic District is 162 acres of weathered porches, tin roofs, and old churches. More than 180 buildings from the late 1800s and early 1900s. It's not polished, and that's the point. The district tells the story of a small Louisiana town that survived, adapted, and kept its soul intact. The Abita Springs Pavilion isn't just a piece of architecture, it's the town's calling card. The center of the myth they sowed to anyone desperate to get out of New Orleans' heat and disease. Built in 1888 with Thomas Selly's hand behind the design, it rose like a Victorian crown over the bubbling mineral springs that gave Abita its name. Selly dressed it up in ornate trim and airy geometry, the kind of fanciful woodwork Victorians loved. But the purpose was practical: shade, air, and a place to sit while you convinced yourself those waters could cure whatever ailed you. Back then, Abita Springs was a health resort. People packed steamboats and railroad cars to come breathe ozone air and drink from the springs, swearing it could chase away yellow fever, malaria, or just the bone-deep exhaustion of city life. The pavilion sat at the center of that fantasy. Musicians set up here, preachers claimed the waters were God's gift, and families in their Sunday best gathered to sip and socialize. This wasn't just leisure, it was ritual, a small-town theater where health, hope, and a little bit of hustle met under a wooden roof. Over the decades, the resort era faded. The mineral water talk got old, but the pavilion didn't vanish. It became a symbol of Abita itself, a stubborn survivor that outlived the hotels and the health craze. By the time it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1975, the pavilion was more than lumber and nails. It was memory, carved into Victorian curves. The Abita Springs Trailhead Museum isn't some glossy, big-budget institution. It's more like the beating heart of a small town that refuses to forget its own history. Sitting right off the Tammany Trace in what was once the town's old railroad depot, the museum leans into the grit and charm of North Shore history. The walls are packed with photographs, maps, and artifacts that tell the tale of Abita Springs, from its days as a healing retreat built on mineral waters, to the resort boom years, to the scrappy resilience of a community that always seems to reinvent itself. It's the kind of place where you can trace the footsteps of early loggers, railroad men, and vacationers who swore the spring waters could cure everything from indigestion to heartbreak. Basic facts: it's small, but it's mighty, free to enter, open to anyone who's curious enough to step inside, and ideally located right at the trailhead, where cyclists, families, and wanderers pass by. The building itself is part of the story, a restored remnant of Abita's railroad past, now pulsing with the kind of local pride that money just can't buy. The exhibits covered the town's resort heyday, the pavilion era, the architectural gems, and the oddball quirks that make Abita, well, Abita. And here's the real kicker: none of it would work without the staff and volunteers. These folks aren't just docents, they're guardians of memory, storytellers who keep the history alive with a mix of grit, humor, and bottomless patience. They show up not for a paycheck or applause, but because they believe this town's history matters, that someone needs to keep the flame lit. Without them, the museum would just be a dusty old depot with a few display cases. With them, it's alive, it breathes, it feels like Abita Springs itself, welcoming, unpolished, authentic, and chock full of heart. Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church isn't some grand cathedral meant to intimidate you into holiness. It's a modest clapboard church thrown up in 1906 by a handful of German and Scandinavian families chasing faith and fresh air on Louisiana's North Shore. Gothic revival, sure, but stripped down to the bones. A sharp little corner steeple, white boards weathered by a century of rain, and stained glass that still splashes color across plain wooden pews. This place has seen it all. Penny drives led by kids to buy lightning rods, potluck suppers in the fellowship hall that started life as a parsonage, and a congregation that's stubborn enough to celebrate its 100th anniversary without losing sight of its roots. It's not about grandeur, it's about grit, community, and the strange poetry of a small Louisiana town keeping faith in a building that feels as much like home as it does a church. Tchefuncte de Choctaw isn't grand, it's grit in brick form. The parish began in 1887 with the modest mission church at Keller and 2nd. By the 1920s, Father Martin Barry rallied enough to build the parish's first brick church, finished in 1923 and designed by Gulf coastal architect Theodore Brune. Its revival style is simple, sturdy, and dignified, with a ceiling crafted by local builder Lawrence Flott. Inside, light filters through arches and stained glass, once accompanied by an organ from the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans. The mission grew into a full parish by 1949, surviving not just as a building, but as a living marker of Abita Springs' faith and history. In plain words, Tchefuncte de Choctaw is humble but enduring, a place where brick, faith, and community still hold steady. The Abita Springs Town Hall doesn't look like much at first glance, just another modest civic building in a sleepy Louisiana town. But peel back a century of paint and you find a schoolhouse built around 1900, when Abita was still selling itself as a resort town for weary New Orleanians in search of fresh pine air and miracle water. Back then, the building rang with the voices of schoolchildren, not council members or clerks. Over time, the town grew, the train slowed, and the classrooms emptied. Instead of tearing it down, Abita did what it always does, recycled the bones of the past and gave them new purpose. The old schoolhouse was remodeled in what is now the Abita Springs Town Hall, a municipal building with history sunk deep in its frame. The old Roche grocery building isn't just another storefront. It's the kind of place that still smells faintly of dust, kerosene, and memories. Built around the early 1900s, this is a building that tried to dress itself up. Not flashy, but ambitious for a small resort town. Its brick facade, pilastered and topped with a false front and parapet, isn't just about shelter, it's about swagger. The kind of architectural elbow someone threw up to say, we mean business, even in our groceries. This wasn't your everyday shotgun-style structure or storefront you raced past. No, Roche's stood proud among simpler wooden buildings, pulling a little weight of permanence into the sandy, pine-scented soil of Abita Springs. When tourists rode off the train hoping that mineral springs and ozone air would cure what ailed them, they probably passed this place on the way to buy provisions, or see who else was buying. Like the best places in this town, it didn't vanish. Instead, it stayed put as everything around it changed. Resorts faded, church bells rang, families grew old. Roche's Grocery sits there now, a marker of an era where architecture wasn't about grandeur. It was about rootedness and a community that wanted to matter. Abita Full Service isn't some gleaming interstate pit stop. It's the real deal. The kind of place that smells like motor oil, hot tires, and yesterday's cigarettes. This old brick service station is part of the bones of Abita Springs. Built back when gas stations were community landmarks, not just credit card swipers. Its brick posts still hold up the canopy like they'd been doing since the very first Model A rolled up. The decorative brickwork isn't fancy, but it's got more soul than any plastic Exxon box could dream of. You can almost hear the echoes of hand pumps clanking and attendants wiping grease on their pants before filling you up and checking your oil. In a town known for pine air and mineral springs, this station stands out as something tougher. A reminder that Abita wasn't just a resort escape. It was a place where people worked, drove, and kept moving. It's still here, still serving, still stubbornly brick, while everything else around it changes. The Abita Brew Pub isn't some polished craft beer temple with Edison bulbs and ironic beards. It's the birthplace, the original garage band stage, where Abita beer first learned to play. Tucked under live oaks on Holly Street, this old brick and cypress building brewed its first batch back in the 1980s, long before microbrew was a buzzword. By the time the operation outgrew the space in '94, the tanks rolled out and this place flipped into a pub. But the bones stayed the same. Cypress windows, wainscoting scarred by years of elbows and spilled pints. Walk in today, and it's all still there. Burgers and gumbo coming out of the kitchen. Kids running the lawn while their parents sip beers you can only get on this side of the Tammany Trace. And a vibe that feels equal parts neighborhood joint and shrine to the craft beer movement's Louisiana roots. It's unpretentious, loud when it needs to be, and the kind of place where a pint of amber tastes better, because it is. The Abita Brew Pub is a small town spot that just happens to get it right. Food, beer, vibe, all of it. I sat down and went straight for the gumbo because of course I did. In Louisiana, you judge a kitchen by how they stir a root. Dark, smoky, with chicken and sausage that tasted like somebody back there still gave a damn. It hit like a shot of honesty. Then I doubled down on the crawfish mac and cheese, which arrived bubbling and unapologetic, rich enough to make you forget yourself. The service here is easy, no fake smiles, just people who seem to actually like working here. And the room itself, well, it has that hum you can't fake. Locals laughing, tourists easing in, the sound of pint glasses clinking like punctuation marks on a story that's been going on here for decades. It's Cajun comfort, brewed and plated without a hint of apology. At the end of the day, the Abita Brew Pub isn't about chasing trends or chasing stars. It's about roots. It's about a town that poured itself into a brewery before anyone south of Portland cared what an IPA was, and then had the guts to keep the taps flowing even after the big tanks moved out. You come here for the beer, sure, but you stay for the feeling, the sense that you're sitting in a place that's seen 1,000 Saturday nights, 100 family birthdays, and more than a few bad days turned good with one bite of gumbo or a pint of amber. It's the North Shore distilled, scrappy, soulful, a little rough around the edges, and exactly what you want it to be. Mandeville sits across the lake like a porch swing facing New Orleans, built on the simple notion that sometimes a man just needs to get the heck out of town. Long before Bernard de Marigny started hawking it in 1834 as a cure for heat and yellow fever, the Tchefuncte people were already here, leaving behind mounds of shells that said, "We were here and we endured." Then came the steamboats, puffing and groaning across the water, carrying city folks and their noise. Dance halls lit up, lakefront camps filled with laughter, and, if you listen close enough, the earliest whisper of jazz sneaking across the waves like a rumor nobody quite believed yet. Later, the automobile arrived, smug as progress always is, and the Causeway Bridge stretched out like a concrete dare, turning Mandeville into just another suburb on the commuter map. But stroll the lakefront under these old oaks today, watch the sunlight wobble on the water, and you'll know better. The bones of the place still hum with its old purpose. This was never just another town. This was New Orleans' back porch, a place to breathe when the city's heat and fever tried to swallow you whole. If you wander down Jefferson Street, you'll trip right over Mandeville's little civic jack of all trades, the schoolhouse townhouse built in 1899 on what must have been the most modest construction budget in Louisiana history, $50 whole. Even in 1897, that was barely enough to buy a mule with bad knees. But the town council stretched it like taffy and declared it would be enough for a building. And somehow, by grit or guile, they got it done. By 1905, the place was pulling double shifts, educating children by day and entertaining aldermen by night. Imagine the scene. Little Johnny learns his ABCs at 9 in the morning, and at 9 in the evening, the mayor's hollering about whether or not chickens can run loose on Marigny Avenue. Same chalkboard, different kind of lesson. Architecturally speaking, it wasn't exactly designed to make Thomas Jefferson swoon. It's a wood-framed box with clapboard siding and a hip roof capped once with a proud little cupola, like the building was trying to stand up straight and borrowed Sunday clothes. Later on, it sprouted a street-facing gable, the architectural equivalent of a second-hand hat that doesn't quite fit but makes you look respectable enough for church. The windows are tall and narrow, lined up like schoolchildren after recess, and they let in just enough daylight to keep you awake during arithmetic or town debates about fencing ordinances. Inside, the floors creak with every step, like the ghosts of teachers and aldermen still want their opinions heard. And here's the kicker, it's still standing. These days, it houses the Mandeville Police Investigation Division, which is fitting since it's been sniffing out trouble of one kind or another for over a century. From truant kids to stray goats to whatever mischief the police chase now, that building has seen it all. It isn't grand, it isn't fancy, but it's got more personality than a whole stack of glass and steel city halls. It's proof that a small town with $50 and a stubborn streak can build something that outlives every single person who once argued, learned, or dozed inside its walls. Mandeville's lakefront has always been less about spectacle and more about escape. Bernard de Marigny, gentleman, gambler, and schemer, carved out this strip of shore in 1834 so folks could breathe free air and maybe forget New Orleans' fever-ridden summers. Nearly 2 centuries later, the park still stretches its mile-long spine along Lake Pontchartrain, lazy as a hound in the heat. The old gazebo, polished back to respectability, sits like a relic of when brass bands once sent their horns sailing out over the water. But it's the oaks that preach the loudest sermon, gnarled giants throwing shade with the kind of confidence only centuries can earn. Come evening time, neighbors drift down here like moths to the lamplight, watching the sun bleed out over the lake. Nothing complicated, nothing fancy, just the simple American luxury of space, water, and time to kill. If you wander down Lakeshore Drive far enough, where the oaks lean heavy toward the water, and the breeze of Lake Pontchartrain still smells faintly like brine, you'll find a house that ought not to exist. The Edwards Hennessy Curry House, sitting polite on Lakeshore Drive, wears its age like a badge of stubbornness. Built around 1825, back when this part of the shore was more wilderness than neighborhood, it's the last living whisper of a time before Mandeville even had a name, let alone a bridge or a traffic jam. This little Creole cottage has bones that would make an architect whistle, brick between post walls, a gable roof pitched so steep you'd think it was trying to climb right into heaven, and a fireplace designed to heat both sides of a room at once. Efficient, clever, and cozy enough to make you forget the damp Louisiana winters. But its real story isn't the mortar or slate. It's the fact that it predates Bernard de Marigny's big plan of 1834 to carve a resort town out of the swamp. While the rest of Mandeville was still a sparkle in a Frenchman's eye, the heirs of an English land grantee named Morgan Edwards were already hammering and sawing here, staking their claim in wood and brick. The house has been passed along like a family tale, whispered from one hand to another. The Morels took it in 1845. Then the Knots held on until just after the Civil War. Each loner left their mark, small ones maybe, but the kind you feel if you sit long enough on the porch. By the 1960s, the wrecking ball had its eye on it, as it does with so many things we later wish we'd have kept. But Robert and Marjorie Hennessy weren't having it. They picked up the whole cottage, like a turtle scooped out of harm's way, and gave it a safer patch of ground a mile west. Today, the Edwards Hennessy Curry House sits on Lakeshore like an old riverboat captain who's seen it all. Storms, owners, schemes, and the slow creep of subdivisions. And it still tips its hat to passers-by. It doesn't brag about being on the National Register of Historic Places, because it doesn't have to. The house speaks for itself, whispering that Mandeville's story doesn't start in 1834. It started right here, in a cottage built before the town had even existed. They call the place Flagstaff now, though it didn't earn that nickname until the 1960s, when somebody thought it was a fine idea to stick a ship mast in the front yard and fly a flag like it was Fort Sumter. But the house itself is a good 100 years older than the mast, and it carries a story that runs a whole lot deeper than the paint on the shutters. The tale starts in 1849 when Citizens Bank of New Orleans decided to auction off a mountain of land. Folks with deep pockets and sharper instincts showed up, and among them was Adelaide Druhard, a wealthy free woman of color. Adelaide's legal designation gave her the rare power to purchase, to own, and to plant roots on soil that others tried to deny her. Soon after, a man named Martin Huntington took hold of this parcel, rolled up his sleeves, and built the house. But his ownership was as short-lived as a mayfly's life. Within the year, he sold it to the Prelia family, who weren't in any hurry to leave. They stayed nearly half a century, until 1900, watching the century turn and the neighborhood shift. Generations came and went under the steep pitch gable roof, the 5-bay facade, staring out at the world like a line of solemn faces in a family portrait. For decades, the cottage was just another quiet soldier in the long parade of Creole homes. Then came 1962, when Robert Wilson sold the place to Dr. Harvey and Melba Calvin. The deed didn't just include the house. It came with a complete inventory of furniture, down to the window units humming in every room. It was in those yellow transfer papers that the name Flagstaff first showed up. Somewhere between the Calvin signatures and the stories told over supper, the mast in the yard turned from a quirky decoration into the christening mark at the house. From then on, it was no longer a cottage. It was Flagstaff. If you ask the Vile family, though, the story has an even longer thread. Their ancestor, Joseph Vile, built so many of the houses around here that his descendants keep a running tally of them, and this cottage makes the list. Maybe he laid the beams, maybe he set the casement, but either way, the Viles are proud to claim it as part of their family's architectural bloodline. If you're walking down Lakeshore Drive and spot a long porch that looks like it was built for rocking chairs, gossip, and a jug of whiskey, odds are you found the Maroney Bay Shack House. Built in 1849, this Creole beauty came with a slate-tiled roof, deep galleries that could shame a steamboat deck, and a view so fine it's probably the reason half of New Orleans tried to plant roots in Mandeville. The first fellow to lay down money was Pierre Poots, a cotton broker fat with cash, who bought up 4 lots for $900 and flipped them a few years later for nearly triple that. Not a bad return for a man who probably never lifted a hammer. But then along came Bernard de Marigny, town founder, gambler, dreamer, and debtor to just about everyone in Christendom. In 1860, with the Civil War thundering at the door, Marigny scooped up the place from the Duke of Tells. Whether he was bailing out a friend or just settling a tab is anyone's guess. But if history teaches us anything, it's that Marigny's money never stayed long in his own pockets. The war made sure he never got to enjoy it. Union gunboats choked the lake, cut off trade, and ordered every wharf torn down, or else burned to the pilings. Folks around here took to smuggling medicine and supplies under the Yankees' noses, but the blockade near starved the town. By the time Marigny cracked his skull on Wall Street in 1868, the house had slipped from his hands like a gambler's last coin. Then came the Arsenault family, who turned the house into a saloon with the kind of reputation that could draw a man off a mule at midnight. Paul's Exchange became Arsenault's and finally landed in the hands of Albert Brichac in 1960. From there it settled down like an old riverboat finally moored into the Brichac restaurant, a place that fed generations and cemented itself as part of the town's backbone. Today, the Brichac family still holds the keys, proof that some houses outlive their owners' follies, wars, and debts, and keep standing on their own 2 feet, weathered, proud, and still watching the lake roll by. If you walk along Lakeshore Drive with your eyes open, you'll come across a building that looks a little sterner than the clapboard cottages and gingerbread porches around you. That's because it's the only antebellum masonry building left standing in Mandeville, a survivor from a time when bricks were a luxury and wood was cheap as kindling. Built around 1815, the place once had broad galleries stretching front and back on its upper floor, the kind where you could rock in a chair and see the whole of Lake Pontchartrain change moods with the weather. Those galleries are gone now, peeled away by the years, but the bones remain. This house wasn't just a house. By the 1860s, it was part of something bigger, a cluster of buildings that came to be known as the Soldiers' Home. Here, wary Confederates, broken in body and spirit, tried to stitch themselves back together. The man with the needle and the thread was Dr. Henri Toussaint, a French immigrant who once carried a physician's kit in Napoleon's army. You have to imagine him, a veteran of European wars, tending to the Southern boys by lamplight, swapping one empire's ghost for another. When Toussaint stepped aside, Dr. Alonzo Gibbons took the chair, keeping the place afloat until 1868, when the money dried up and the doors closed. Gibbons wasn't done, though. Around 1880, he put up his own medical office on this very block, facing Marigny Avenue. That building still stands in residential quiet, a reminder that the work of tending wounds and curing fevers didn't disappear just because the war did. As for the old masonry structure, it eventually passed into the hands of the Madden family, who held on to it for more than 50 years. Time worked on it. Storms tested it. These days it's living its best life as Don't's on the Lake, a tavern with a loyal following and the kind of grit that makes it the first joint to unlock its doors and pour a drink after the floodwaters of a tropical storm slide back into the basin. So, the Kuzak Madden House has been a hotel, a hospital, a family stronghold, and now a bar. Every brick and every missing gallery tells a story, and if you squint at it long enough, you can see the soldiers walking up the steps, the doctors sharpening their scalpels, and the locals gathering at the bar. Different centuries, same address, all stitched together into one stubborn Louisiana landmark. Now here's a house that doesn't give a hoot about keeping up with the neighbors. Built around 1835, back when Mandeville was little more than a handful of dreams hammered together out of cypress and brick. This Creole cottage went up without the fancy galleries everybody else seems so proud of. No wide porches for gossip or rocking chairs, just solid brick between post walls, standing their ground against the lake breeze, like a farmer in overalls at a ballroom dance. It started out as part of a farm that sprawled across the square, back when the lakefront still smelled more corn and manure than perfume and suntan lotion. But time has a way of changing a place's manners. By 1943, the Society of the Redemptionists had moved in, turning the old cottage into a retreat, and pinning a brand new name on it, the Little Flower Villa. They borrowed that from Centuries à l'Azur, the little flower who preached humility, which suited the cottage just fine. It had been practicing humility since the day it was first nailed together. Today it sits there on the National Register of Historic Places, holding court without saying much, which is about the wisest thing a house can do. Folks stroll past under the oaks, maybe see nothing but an old building with peeling shutters. But if you squint sideways at it, you can still hear the whir of farm life, the low murmur of redemptionist prayers, and the eternal chuckle of the lake slapping at the shore. Enjoying the video? Become a GCC member for our exclusive podcast, fun emojis, and our badges. Hit that join button below to check it out. Now, if you wander 3 blocks back from the lake, past the oaks that stand like old preachers with their arms stretched out, you'll find a squat wooden hall that looks like it ought to be a barn, but somehow it became the birthplace of joy. That's the Dewdrop Social and Benevolent Association Hall, planted in 1895 by a handful of African American neighbors who had more sense of community than the insurance companies ever would. They set it up to feed the hungry, tend the sick, bury the dead, and lend a hand when life tossed a man head first into bad luck. And here's the thing about the Dewdrop. While it was built for mercy, it became a temple of music. Long before the boys from Millenburg, cornets shining, clarinets wailing, were catching the steamboat across Lake Pontchartrain to Mandeville, by Saturday night, the unpainted hall shook with stomping feet, laughter, and enough brass to wake the saints. Folks will tell you that the Dewdrop is the oldest untouched rural jazz dance hall in the world, and I reckon they're right, because it still smells of pine wood, sweat, and a music so new it nearly burned the paint off the walls, if it ever had any. In its prime, the place was like a who's who of early jazz. Buddy Petit, the cornet king, who some say could blow circles around young Louis Armstrong, played here. Kid Ory, Bunk Johnson, Papa Celestine, and a dozen others whose names still bounce around jazz lore like marbles on a wooden floor. And yes, Armstrong himself, Satchmo, the man who carried jazz out of New Orleans and into the world. He stood right there on that little stage. Some say even after he got famous, he'd sneak back into Mandeville in the 1930s and 40s, slip through the side door, and blow the roof off just to remind himself what music was supposed to feel like. The good times didn't last forever. By the 1940s, insurance companies finally decided black folks could pay premiums, benevolent societies faded, and the dewdrop doors sagged shut. The hall sat abandoned, a ghost with no music in its bones, while a new hall down on Marigny Avenue stole the spotlight. But a funny thing about wood, it remembers. In 2000, the city of Mandeville took the place back, and by 2007, the old hall was stomping again, packed shoulder to shoulder for jazz shows, where every note seemed to echo with the ghost of Buddy, Satchmo, and all the rest who played here. Today, the dewdrop stands, unpainted, stubborn, and shaded by oaks, like an old man who's seen it all, but isn't done telling his stories. Step inside when the band strikes up, and you'll feel it. That reckless story that once crossed the lake on a steamboat and landed in Mandeville, never to leave again. If you want to see the kind of faith that bends but never breaks, walk down Lamarck Street until you reach the first Free Mission Baptist Church. It's a modest wooden frame with a lapboard belfry, not much for ornamentation, but it tells a story taller than any steeple. The church was born in the late 1870s, when freedom was still fresh on the tongue, but hard to swallow in practice. A group of African American residents of Mandeville, determined to worship under their own roof, began holding local prayer meetings in kitchens and parlors. Sister Frances and Sister Clements Holliday were among the faithful who threw their doors open, filling small rooms with hymns and hope. They weren't just building a church, they were building independence, something no one could take away. In 1881, Elder Henry Davis scrapped together $15, no small sum for that time, and bought the lot from the widow Gallup. With that deed in hand, the congregation finally had ground to stand on. Boards were nailed, prayers stitched together into the rafters, and the first Free Mission Baptist Church took shape. The name itself was the declaration: free people on free soil, worshiping in their own house of God. Step back from the road today, and the building looks much as it did more than a century ago. The old bell, still tucked into its lapboard belfry, waits like a veteran ready to answer roll call. You can almost hear it if you listen hard enough. The clang that once summoned fishermen, laborers, mothers, and children from across Mandeville, calling them not just to worship, but to belonging. This is more than a Sunday house. In the decades after the Civil War, black churches like this one doubled as schools, meeting halls, and safety nets. If a neighbor was sick, food appeared. If someone passed on, the congregation helped bury them with dignity. When the world outside refused them insurance, respect, or a fair chance, the church filled the gap. And yet, the first Free Mission Baptist Church never set out to be grand. Its gifts have always been enduring. For nearly a century and a half, it has stood there quietly among the live oaks, a testament to determination carved out of faith. It does not shout, it does not shine, but it endures, and that, in the end, may be the holiest thing of all. The Mandeville Cemetery is as old as the town itself, set aside in 1834 when Bernard de Marigny was carving out his summer refuge out of pine woods and lake breezes. Folks needed a place to bury their dead, and this patch of ground became it. The first marker still standing is for Louis Emile de Bourgh, who died in 1835. A reminder that while the town was new, death was not. It's 5 acres now, expanded in 1877, but it feels bigger when you walk it. Iron fences lean with age. Marble angels have lost noses and fingers, and the tombs sit above the ground like little houses of the departed. Vaults, family crypts, and the Prudhomme tomb that looks near about like a church in miniature. The Civil War left its shadow here too. In 1862, a Confederate lieutenant was the first soldier laid to rest, and in the years after, A few more veterans found their way under these oaks with the help of Dr. Alonzo Gibbons, who donated space. Walk through today and you'll see the whole story of Mandeville written in stone and moss. Settlers, mayors, soldiers, children taken way too soon, whole families stacked into vaults that have stood longer than most of the houses here. It isn't just a cemetery. It's a history book you can walk through if you don't mind the company. If you ever wanted proof that bread can bind a town tighter than politics or parades, you do well to stop at the corner of Lafayette and Jefferson and look at the Griffin Raquet Bakery. Built around 1900, the old place has worn many hats: general store, bakery, gathering spot, and it still carries the smell of yeast and wood smoke in its bones, even though the brick oven that once baked half of Mandeville is long gone. The story begins with the Dutch Bouquet family, who threw up the first walls, probably never guessing that their store would one day be remembered less for dry goods than for crusty loaves and gossip over the counter. By 1920, the Griffins had moved in, hammering together a bakery in the back that made it their second bakery in town. The first had been just a block closer to the lake, but folks don't remember that one the same way. This one had the staying power, the personality. It became a landmark, a crossroads where people traded not just money for bread, but stories, laughter, and the latest, "You didn't hear it from me, but." In 1939, the Griffins sold out to another family, but the ovens never cooled for long. The building saw a century worth of hands pass through it, each one keeping the lights on and the flour dust rising. By the time 1996 rolled around, the place had worn thin, like a favorite jacket patched too many times. That's when John Finran, a local with more stubbornness and sense, stepped in. He set about restoring the old building, making sure it didn't collapse into memory the way so many others have. Today, this old bakery stands on the National Register of Historic Places, not because it's fancy, but because it reminds us what towns were built on. Not banks, not courthouses, not grand hotels, but small places where flour met fire and neighbors came together. Fontainebleau State Park is a curious patch of land where history lingers like the sweet, sticky smell of sugarcane that once grew here in endless rows. Back in 1829, Bernard de Marigny, scoundrel, dreamer, gambler of fortunes, staked his claim to 5,000 acres and christened it Fontainebleau after the royal French forest he was too restless to live in, but happy enough to borrow the name from. He raised cane, baked bricks, and squeezed sugar in a mill that rattled and groaned until only ruins remained. Today, hikers, campers, and day trippers wander the same grounds where enslaved men and women once cut sugarcane under a punishing sun, and where the master's big plans fell apart like dice in a losing hand. Oddly enough, what endures is Marigny's insistence on an open shoreline, a covenant scribbled nearly 2 centuries back that still shapes Mandeville's lakefront, keeping a ribbon of space for sunsets, breezes, and the simple pleasure of staring out over the lake. The old plantation has traded in its sugar fields for campfires, its mill for picnic tables. But the ghosts walk here still. And the oaks keep their secrets. Louisiana North Shore towns of Slidell, Lacombe, and Pearl River aren't just dots on a map in St. Tammany Parish. They're storybooks written in pine and cypress. Here, buildings aren't just lumber and nails. They're voices from the past, still speaking from New Orleans' back porch. Slidell, Louisiana is a town born of grit, swampland, and a lucky break or two. Perched on Lake Pontchartrain, it began in the 1830s with timber and tar camps before the railroad showed up in the 1880s and turned it into a bustling junction. Immigrants, Italian, German, Irish, brought shops, churches, and saloons, giving the place its bones and its name from a senator nobody knew here. The 20th century brought shipyards, wartime booms, and hurricanes that tested its people but never broke them. By the 1960s, NASA's nearby Stennis Space Center made Slidell part blue-collar, part rocket science. Today, it's a commuter hub and hometown, where I-10 roars but the bayou still whispers. Old storefronts we call lumber barons and bootleggers, while subdivisions creep into the pines. Slidell doesn't strut like New Orleans. It endures, rooted and weathered, like the cypress knees in its swamps. Down in Old Town Slidell, tucked in on Carey Street, there sits a grand old ghost called the Arcade Theater. The Arcade Theater first threw her lights on back in 1927, when a stucco brick box with the kiss of Spanish tile was all the Hollywood Slidell, Louisiana thought it needed. Step through that shaded entryway. In the name of A. Corollo, the fellow who footed the bill greets you like a proud host. Off to the left, a ticket booth no bigger than a birdhouse waited to hand you stubs for the smash hit movies of 1927. The Jazz Singer, the first talkie that shook Hollywood's bones.
Goodbye. Don't cry.
Or Wings, the barnstorming World War I epic that flew off with the very first Oscar for Best Picture of the Year. Come Saturday night, that place was a thunderstorm of teenagers, elbow to elbow, calling it the courting place, where the silver screen could swing from Roy Rogers' cowboy ballads to Buck Rogers' space adventures in the blink of an eye. During the war years, folks packed in for the newsreels, moving pictures fresher than the morning newspaper, watching history flicker 12 feet high. But time, as she always does, pulled the plug on the magic. Television stole the crowds, and by 1963, the curtain fell. Still, the bones held steady, waiting for someone to love her again. That someone came in 1999 when Kevin Jordan rolled up his sleeves, rebuilt the stage, and let the old girl open her doors to weddings, speeches, and nights worth remembering. These days, she goes by Arcade on Carey, bringing the fun through sports simulators while the bar keeps the glasses slinging. Yet, if you look close at the arches, the tiles, the glow of her frame, you'll see she still whispers her old stories, proud as ever to be part of the show. The Arcade Theater remembers when movies were young, and so was Slidell. The Slidell Railroad Station on Front Street came along in 1913, when timber, brick, and creosote were the local kings, and the rails were the royal road to market. The town itself sprang from a railroad camp and grew up with two lines, the New Orleans and Northeastern and the New Orleans and Great Northern. So this depot became the handshake between Slidell and the rest of the world. Even today, the Crescent City still rolls in and out, a daily reminder that the old iron spine is still alive and kicking. Architecturally, the place is a long, low brick runner with a hipped roof that throws generous shade, its deep eaves riding on big, decorative cut wooden brackets, the sort of practical swagger that makes you think of the prairie school without any of the big city fuss. Inside, the first floor once held segregated waiting rooms, a reminder that old Slidell Depot carried the weight of Jim Crow in its very design. Built in 1913, it opened with two rooms divided by law and custom, one marked white only and the other colored. That separation was no accident. Louisiana had been enforcing divided travel since the 1890s. The signs finally came down after the Freedom Riders pushed Washington to act, with the Interstate Commerce Commission banning segregated stations in 1961, and the Civil Rights Act in 1964 closing the book on it for good. No great protests flared here, but every traveler who passed through felt the burden of those times. If you squint, you can almost see the spur lines spreading out to the town's mills and factories. Salmon Brothers Brick and Lumber, the Creosote Works, the Grain Company, all of them hugging the tracks like barnacles on a piling. feeding boxcars headed across the lake and far, far beyond. That's the story this depot tells without saying a word. A small Gulf Coast town, hitching its fortunes to steel rails and making good on the bet. Well now, if you wander down Cleveland Avenue and come upon a stately framed house set back from the road upon a generous plot, that's the one. That's the Albert Salmon House. It rose around 1890 as the home of Albert Salmon, scion of the Salmon brothers. And before he shuffled off his mortal coil in 1931, that house was his harbor amid the bustling timber and brick empire his family built here in Slidell. Architecturally, oh, it's a story told in high ceilings and old world craftsmanship. This place is no mere shack. It's big, sitting on nearly an acre and stretching over 5,000 square feet of floor space. So grand it whispers, I'm somebody's fine home. So picture Mr. Albert, his days set between brick kilns and lumber yards, coming home to this proud house on Cleveland Street as twilight fell. The porch swing ticking, the flicker of oil lamps soft on the walls. The carved mantels and frescoes catching the glow as he tipped his hat and thought, Lordy, I've gone and built my fortune, and a fine house to match. That's the story of the Salmon House. Real as a railroad spike, as grand as magnolia in bloom, and standing still to tell its tale. Well now, Albert Salmon's brother Fritz also built his home on Cleveland Avenue. It still stands today, a stately cousin of Queen Anne's court, raised around 1895 when steam whistles were the language of progress and the bayou breed commerce in every gust. From its lot across the street, Fritz could look out toward his brickyard, the very enterprise that shaped much of Slidell's growth. The house shows its years in layers, Victorian roots dressed with early 20th century touches. After Fritz passed in 1934, it became the home of Homer G. Fritchie Sr., who steered Slidell as mayor for over 3 decades. So picture Fritz himself, hands dusty, standing at that window, watching the brickyard churn. This isn't just a house. It's ambition and clapboard and shingle, still whispering of a Slidell in bloom. The Swiss chalet-style house was always something of a curiosity in America, a European daydream translated into wood and shingle. Born of alpine slopes and snowy gables, the style wandered across the Atlantic in the 19th century, popping up in scattered places where immigrants carried pieces of their homeland in their toolboxes. In the South, such houses were rare birds, too fanciful for the flat pine woods, too alpine for the Louisiana swamps. Yet ever so often one appeared like a misplaced echo of the mountains, a reminder that memory can be built into rafters as surely as into song.
The hills are alive with the sound of music.
Louisiana, with its gumbo of cultures, claimed one such gem in Slidell. The Salmon House, raised up in 1895 by that family of Swiss immigrants who made their fortune in brick and timber. It stands today as a strange and striking outlier. Its steep gables, scalloped shingles, and carved brackets speak once of snow and chalets, though now they peek out from behind tangles of trees and vines, half hidden from the street. Overgrown, hard to glimpse in full, the house still whispers its heritage, that alpine dreams can still find footing even in bayou soil. The Salmon House is less a residence now than a monument, an ample, ambitious build that endures despite weather, growth, and change. In a landscape dominated by shotgun cottages and Creole townhouses, it is a rare reminder of what immigrants brought with them, not just muscle for the mills, but a vision of beauty shaped by another horizon. Over the last couple of decades, Slidell's Hispanic community has brought new life to the town, filling markets with fresh flavors, churches with Spanish hymns, and neighborhoods with the warmth of family gatherings. Their businesses, from restaurants to construction crews, have strengthened the local economy, while their tradition of faith, food, and resilience has blended seamlessly into the community. Today, Slidell feels brighter, richer, and more connected thanks to their presence. Marinita Plus sits right there on Gauls Boulevard in Slidell, and it's become a real anchor for the town's growing Hispanic community. Open every day from sunup till well after supper, this place is more than just a corner grocery. It's where you can find fresh produce, cuts of meat, and those hard-to-track-down Latin staples that turn supper into something special. Come the weekend, and the aisles carry the smell of menudo and barbacoa, a sure sign that the kitchen's humming just as lively as the cash registers. Folks say it's friendly on the wallet too, with weekly deals posted to keep the shelves turning. When you walk in, you'll feel it. Neighbors, cultures, and flavors mixing together under one roof, just like a pot of gumbo that just keeps getting richer. There was no way I was coming this close to one of my favorite gator tours without me tipping my hat to those toothy old friends of mine. So I rang up Dr. Wagner's Honey Island Swamp Tours, my tried and true outfit for such adventures, only to find out they shifted their launch to a new spot. These days, they're sharing a dock with Cajun Encounters, another fine bunch of people who know their way around a swamp like the back of their hand. Now, the ramp may wear a Slidell dress, but that's just ink on paper. Truth is, it sits a mere hop from town. 10 minutes northeast on Highway 90, 12 if fortune frowns at the stoplights. And you'll be easing down to the water, close enough to hear a train whistle if the breeze is kind. But once the boat noses into the moss-draped cypress, you'll swear Slidell had fallen clean off the map. That's the wonder of it all. One moment you're jostling with traffic, the next you're sliding back in time to a river wilderness that looks much the same as it did when the first flatboats came drifting down the Pearl River. And here's the plain truth of this arrangement. Dr. Wagner's folks weren't swallowed up whole by Cajun Encounters, like some duck unlucky enough to wander past a hungry gator. No, this was more like two riverboats tying up side by side for a spell. Dr. Wagner's crew still runs their same boats, spins their same yarns, and keeps a sharp eye peeled for gators lurking in the duckweed. Cajun Encounters, they simply bring the dock, the check-in shed, and the comforts that keep restless tourists from wandering off. Call it a neighborly handshake, a marriage of convenience where nobody had to change their name. The swamp stays the same, the adventure stays the same, only now it begins with a shinier porch to step off from. Now kick back and let's check in with some of our favorite swamp varmints. The town of Lacombe is situated on a pine-shadowed bend of a bayou where swamp meets lake. Choctaw, Houma, and later French and Creole families have left their mark. And though highways and mailboxes eventually showed up, the place has kept its backwoods hum. Even now it rings with church bells, cicadas, and trucks. History here hangs like Spanish moss. The water is always moving. In Lacombe, the Francois Cousin house sits back from Main Street like an old riverboat captain, weathered, stubborn, and proud of every scar it's picked up since the bayou was the best road in town. The core of the place likely rose around 1719, then saw a major facelift about 1820. Its French Creole style shows in the irregular rhythm of its facade, the doors and windows placed for shade and air rather than symmetry. The front once carried a full gallery with beaded beams. Later owners stretched a side gallery and topped it with a small gablet roof. And in the early 1900s, a shed roof addition tacked onto the rear, the way families tack on rooms for growing households. Around it once stood the working spreads of a plantation. Barns, a kitchen, a cooper's shed, and a dozen huts where enslaved people lived and labored. Francois Cousin, one of the North Shore's largest landowners, made this his homestead. Live oaks crowded the yard. The bayou breathed at its back, and the house bore witness to the slow carving of St. Tammany Parish, from frontier to farmland. Today the property holds 3 green acres on Main Street and a place on the National Register. It survives as one of the parish's rare early buildings, a reminder that in St. Tammany Parish, the past doesn't just whisper, it creaks, leans, and stands still. Well now, if you find yourself wandering down St. Mary's Street in Lacombe, you'll come across a little white schoolhouse that has more stories tucked in its timbers than most folks carry in a lifetime. Built in 1913 with 2 simple rooms and a tin-hip roof, it started out as the town's pride. The Lacombe School, where generations of children scratched their ABCs on chalkboards and learned their sums while the bayou breeze slipped through the windows. When the newer schools came along and the desk grew quiet, the old place didn't fade away. In 1976, it was reborn as the Bayou Lacombe Museum, a keeper of memories and traditions. Time and weather may have worn out its boards, but folks around here took care to set it up right again, even giving it a fresh polish in 2019. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it stands as Lacombe's own living scrapbook, proof that even in the humblest buildings can hold a whole community's heart. The story of the Sacred Heart of Jesus Catholic Church in Lacombe reads like one of those Louisiana sagas where faith and weather keep squaring off. Back in 1890, folks set aside land for a little church they first meant to call St. Cecilia. But when the 1915 hurricane nearly tore it to splinters, the only thing left standing proved to be a statue of the Sacred Heart. That miracle changed the name, and by 1918 the new church was up and blessing Bayou families. Time and termites wore the frame building down, so in 1963, Father Harry Smith led the way to a handsome brick church with stained glass shining from St. Scholastica's old chapel. But fate wasn't done yet. Fire claimed that building in 1993. Parishioners didn't give up. They raised a new Sacred Heart Church from the ashes and dedicated it in 1996, where it still stands today on Main Street. Tucked back in the pines of North Lacombe, you'll find the little Our Lady of Lourdes Shrine, a place that feels half wild and wholly holy. Father Francis Bailey and the townsfolk built it in 1923, choosing a ravine with a spring that reminded him of the grotto at Lourdes, France. They hauled stone, raised a chapel, and by that summer, the first Mass was said, setting the stage for a century of quiet pilgrimages. Folks came during the war years to dip from the spring and whisper prayers, and they've kept coming ever since, even after time and vandals left their scars. The shrine has always been patched back together by loving hands, because Lacombe isn't about to let go of a blessing like this. There aren't posted hours or a ticket window, just a quiet clearing on Davis Road, open when you wander up, best visited in the daylight. It's not a tourist stop so much as a standing invitation. Come when your heart needs peace, and you'll find it waiting in the shade of the pine. Bayou Lacombe has been carrying stories longer than anyone can remember. First the Choctaw and Houma, slipping pirogues through the cypress shade, leaving shell piles and old trails under the palmettos. Then came the French, planting a little mission church in 1720 and trading furs and fish down to New Orleans. Freedmen and Creole families followed, cutting gardens out of the woods, hauling moss, and working the shrimping nets. A post office, a school, and a highway eventually tied the place to the wider world. But the bayou never lost its wild hum. Even now, with herons lifting off the marsh and church bells drifting across the water, Bayou Lacombe keeps on moving, steady, quiet, and as stubborn as ever. Well now, St. Joseph's Abbey Church over in St. Benedict doesn't just rest in the pines, it seems to lift right out of them, as if the forest itself decided to grow a cathedral. The Benedictine monks set to work on it in the 1880s, stacking every brick with the kind of patience only men who've taken vows of silence and eternity could muster. She wears her Romanesque style, plain and proud, broad shoulders, rounded arches, and walls so thick they look ready to shrug off hurricanes, floods, and whatever else Louisiana might throw her way. The red brick glows warm against the limestone trim, and above it all, a steady bell tower hums its presence without ever needing to shout. For more than a century, the church has stood as a sermon in stone, weathering storms and bearing witness to countless footsteps across its threshold. It doesn't try to be the grandest church in the world, and that's the beauty of it. Like a good tale told slow, or a glass of whiskey savored neat, it carries its weight with quiet dignity. St. Joseph's Abbey Church speaks through the arches and brickwork, through bells and silence, a piece of medieval Europe rooted deep in the Louisiana backwoods, built to last as long as faith itself. Down in the little village of Folsom, there stands a one-room wooden building folks still call Aunt Deasy's Library. Built back in the 1940s, this was no grand marble hall, just a humble shack tucked on the corner of Broadway Street and Leon Alley. But for decades, it held the town's imagination. Children padded in on bare summer feet to flip through dog-eared books. Farmers lingered a spell on rainy afternoons, and the place smelled of paper and pine boards. By 1987, a new library had come along, and the old one drifted into quiet neglect, its paint weather-peeling and vines curling around the eaves. But folks in Folsom never quite forgot it. In recent years, neighbors and volunteers have rolled up their sleeves, patching the boards and bringing Aunt Deasy's Library back to life. Not just as a building, but as a reminder that even the smallest towns can hold big stories between their walls. The town of Pearl River never had a master plan. It just gathered itself along the piney banks in the late 1800s, born of timber, turpentine, and fish floating down to New Orleans. By 1906, it had a post office and a plain name from the stream that cut through the swamps. The railroad and then Highway 41 tied it closer to the world, but the place stayed rough-edged, with churches, schools, and country stores weathering hurricanes and mill smoke. Today, it may be a humble crossroads, half commuter town, half backwoods, where bayous still curl through the cypress, and the past still whispers in the pines. The Hoswood store, out on Highway 1091, is one of those places that seems to hold the whole story of Pearl River in its weathered boards and stubborn bones. Built back in 1930 when the highway was little more than a ribbon of gravel, tying farms and timber camps to the wider world. It started out as a country store, but quickly became the beating heart of a small community. Folks didn't just come here for flour, sugar, or kerosene. They came for news, for company, and for that slow-spun rhythm of life where a nickel's worth of candy could buy you an afternoon's worth of smiles. Through the years, the Hoswood store stood steady as the highway widened and traffic picked up. Its front porch watched generations pass. farmers swapping stories, children chasing dogs in the yard, and travelers ducking in to escape the heat. By the time it earned a spot on the National Register of Historic Places, the old store was already a monument to endurance, a reminder that in St. Tammany Parish, history doesn't just live in museums, it lingers in clapboard walls and creaking floorboards, whispering the tale of a town that grew up around a little crossroads, a commerce, and kinship. The tale of St. Joe's Brickyard and Pearl River reads like a hymn to clay and fire. It all began in 1891, when an Irish immigrant named Joseph Ory, nicknamed St. Joe by the locals, set up shop along the banks of the Pearl. He didn't have much more than a strong back and a knack for working the red clay that lay thick in the soil. But he turned that mud into bricks that built whole towns. His dream was simple: take the earth underfoot, bake it hard in the kiln, and let it stand for generations. By 1895, Joe had to sell the operation to another brickmaster, Peter Schneider, but the name St. Joe clung to the yard like moss on cypress. Through the years, the brickyard grew into a pauper institution. Workers pulled clay from the wide pits, molded it by hand or machine, and fired it until it glowed like embers. Those bricks, tough, red, and honest, went into courthouses, churches, schools, and homes all across Louisiana and Mississippi. The place carried on through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and more than a few hurricanes. Each time the waters rose or the markets dipped, the brickyard fired up again, steady as a church bell. Today, St. Joe's Brickyard still makes those same handmade bricks, each one a little rough around the edges, each one whispering back to the roots in Pearl River's clay fields. It's more than a business, it's a place of living heritage.
Well, I sit down and down. Oh, my baby's hand. And I sat down the one day. Said, come on in now, honey. She said, my husband just left. She said, my baby just left.